Welcome. I'm Colin Mulworthy. I'm Dean of the Harris School of Public Policy here at the University of Chicago, and it's a pleasure to introduce one of my colleagues for this session. Ethan Bueno de Mesquita is Deputy Dean at Harris and also Professor in the school. He's a game theorist, something we tolerate, not necessarily welcome, and he will be bringing to bear on a very interesting and vital subject, the way of thinking about the world that game theorists tend to demonstrate whenever they speak. It'll be helpful to you to know that Ethan thinks everything really should be addressed in game theoretic terms. I think that's accurate, that other forms of thought are really poor substitutes for game theory. He's been integrally connected at the school with the development of a new center that we've just established, the Center for Policy Entrepreneurship, which is unusual in that it moves us from where we used to be in terms of carrying out analysis, program evaluation, policy evaluation, to arrive at an understanding of what the best policy would be, moving from that to a situation where we would like to know not so much what the best policy would be, but what's the best policy that has any hope of implementation, which is an unusual step for the university to move away from the academy into something like the real world, although you'll be glad to hear we don't actually go into the real world, but we talk about the real world as if we had something to do with it. Ethan is going to talk about his work on asymmetric conflict, in particular terrorism, insurgency, and rebellion, which many of you will have read over my shoulder while you were waiting for me to finish. So it's just a pleasure for me to introduce Ethan. He'll talk for some period of time, then there will be a question and answer session. Then I will come back and thank him, and then we can all leave. Ethan.
Thanks, Colm. It's really a pleasure to be here. In addition to being a faculty member, I'm an alum of the college, and so I'm particularly happy to get to talk to you. And in the Q&A, I'm happy to take questions about political violence as well as the great books if you want to see how my education went. It was long enough ago that we did the great book still. Okay, so I want to talk about not only my own work, but actually a whole collection of research that's been done by a lot of scholars, which I'm calling the new science of violence, or the new science of political violence, because it's largely a literature that has grown very, very quickly since 9/11. So asymmetric conflict, various forms of asymmetric conflict, terrorism, insurgency, other forms of rebellion, is really sort of a first-order policy issue in the world. I think quite obviously the United States has spent literally trillions of dollars on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism in the period after 9/11. Asymmetric conflicts have cost tens of thousands of lives in many countries around the world, ongoing obviously in Syria right now, tens of thousands of lives as part of a counterterrorism and counterinsurgency campaign in Pakistan over the last decade, threatens the sort of global stability in various ways, threatens the regional stability of the Middle East. Civil wars in Africa, of course, have cost literally hundreds of thousands of lives in many countries. It's really sort of thinking about the causes of asymmetric conflict, small-scale conflict, and how to try and prevent or end it has become really a central concern of American foreign policy and foreign policy all over the world over the last decade or two. And so scholars have turned their attention to it in kind of a new way that I want to talk to you about. There's, of course, always been work on conflict and civil wars and terrorism in the social sciences and in various parts of the humanities. What sort of typifies the new work that's being done by sort of a new generation of scholars is a really careful attention both to sort of theorizing, to taking seriously that the dynamics of asymmetric conflict are very strategically complex and need to be thought through very carefully, lest we make mistaken inferences when we look out at the world. And also a real attention to microdata, to try and look very carefully inside conflicts, to try and understand what's going on in a very fine-grained way, in a way really inspired by the kind of policy research that those of you who were at the last session heard about, that scholars have done for a long time on social policy, on education policy, on other forms of domestic policy where data access is, of course, much easier and much safer, but inspired by that kind of thinking to try and look inside conflicts in a very careful way. And so today I want to give you sort of an overview of the ways in which that has happened, to give you a sense, sort of the tip of the iceberg of the kinds of questions people are asking, the kinds of challenges associated with answering them, and what we kind of know to the best of our ability, but also to give you a sense that there are no easy answers, that there are no sort of pat recommendations to be had about how we end conflict, that these things are not just a matter of being willing to spend enough money or having the political will. It's not like if we decided, we the United States or we the United Nations decided that tomorrow what we wanted to do was really firmly dedicate ourselves to the ending of political violence or reduction of asymmetric conflict, we'd know a lot about what to do next, having made that decision. And I want to give you a sense of why that is and how difficult and rich this topic really is. To give you a little bit of sense of what's at stake, I've told you a little bit about dollar figures and lives lost. Asymmetric conflict, in addition to its sort of immediate effects in terms of killing people, in terms of destabilizing political regimes, really has far-reaching effects on society. It affects the way people live their lives long after the conflicts are done. It affects public health, et cetera. Let me just show you a couple graphs to give you a sense in a couple, I think, one cute and the other not as cute, but I think telling way, to give a sense of not just that this kills people and destabilizes, but it lasts for a long time. So the following graph is from, I think, a very clever paper. On the x-axis of this graph is a measure of how many years a country of origin of a person experienced civil war over the last several decades. Okay? So it's how much civil war you're likely to have been exposed to in your life if you're from a given country. And the y-axis, the data plotted, and then the line, which shows the upward relationship, is yellow and red cards in soccer games from the national soccer team. Okay? So this is supposed to be sort of a cute measure of the propensity for violent or asocial behavior of people from a given society. And what you see is actually quite a strong relationship between being from a country that's experienced a lot of conflict and engaging in violent behavior in professional sports. You mean how big the circles are? It's the number it's the number of observations for the country. So it's how precise our estimates are for a particular country. So this is just a cute way of saying, look, this isn't just about people. This doesn't just manifest itself while people are shooting at each other. Having experienced civil war in your country bleeds over to your life sort of forever. The next picture I want to show you is from a study in Israel by a couple Israeli economists. So this is looking at some data from Israeli small claims court, which is small cases under $4,000 or thereabouts. And so what we have here is the two columns on the left are the probability that a plaintiff's claim is accepted by a judge if that judge is Jewish, which is the blue column, or if that judge is Arab, which is the green column. And so on the left you see essentially no difference between the two judges. Jewish judges and Arab judges are kind of equally likely to find for a Jewish plaintiff. And similarly, on the right, if the plaintiff is Arab, again, you see relatively, there's small gaps, but those aren't significantly different from each other. Now, this is for small claims courts in a month in which there has not been a terrorist attack within the vicinity of the court building. The next picture is going to be for the exact same kinds of cases, same courts, but for months in which there has been a terrorist attack within the vicinity of the court building. And what you see is what looks like evidence of massive discrimination. Jewish judges are massively more likely to find for Jewish plaintiffs and against Arab plaintiffs, and Arab judges are massively more likely to find for Arab plaintiffs and against Jewish plaintiffs. The suggestion being that the experience, even if you don't directly experience the violence, being in a conflict setting tears people apart, even in these kinds of highly professionalized, bureaucratized settings where you might not think that these kinds of cleavages are at play. So the consequences for the way people live their lives and the consequences for the fabric of a society are really very serious. Okay, so this has now stopped working, so I'll do this. So today I want to talk about how we think about preventing or ending political violence. And in particular, I want to start with a question which I think often is sort of at the foremost of people's minds when they think about this as a policy issue, which is that it's all about poverty, and that the thing to do if we want to take people out of violence is to improve their economic well-being. And I want to talk about some things we know or don't know about that. And then I also want to talk a little bit about ongoing research evaluating various forms of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism policy to give you a sense of the kind of work people have done trying to understand what we can understand about the ways governments try to fight or end violence. Okay, so let's start with poverty or violence. poverty and violence. So here's a quote from President Bush shortly after 9/11, talking about the need to invest in economic development in response to terrorism. And he says, "We fight against poverty because hope is an answer to terror." And the idea being, I think, that people engage in acts of political violence because they're desperate, because they have miserable lives, and they're trying to achieve change. And that maybe if we could make people's lives better, they wouldn't be so inclined to kill other people. Right? Now, when scholars think about the relationship between the economy and political violence, I think there's lots of channels. Here's 4 of them. I think there's actually, we could spend all day making a list of various ways the economy might affect violence. But here's just a few that people tend to think about. So, and you'll see that they can go kind of in either way. So when you make people richer, one thing that might happen is that they might be less upset, they might be less aggrieved. They might have what an economist would call higher opportunity costs, right? That is, they have a good job, they're making money, and to leave that job and go engage in violence is more costly to them than it would be were they unemployed and miserable. And that the thought is, and this is President Bush's thought, that that's going to reduce conflict. Another kind of thought people have is that if you can grow an economy, you're going to strengthen the state. And that what political violence is really about is about a lack of state capacity, that the state doesn't have control over its territory, and this allows insurgent movements to get a handhold and engage in violence. And so this, again, might decrease conflict. But it could go the other way, too. So, for example, a thing that might happen is when you make a country richer in various ways, people who are thinking about trying to seize parts of that country suddenly are trying to seize part of a rich country, which is a more attractive thing to do than seizing part of a poor country. One of the ways we tend to think about that is, a country that suddenly discovers mineral deposits, suddenly discovers diamonds, suddenly discovers oil, right? That all of a sudden that's a prize worth fighting for. And so that kind of economic gain might tend to increase conflict. Another is that flows of money into a country can become resources for rebels. This is a very common story people tell about foreign aid. That foreign aid flows to a country, it ends up getting either captured or taxed by rebels to fund the insurgency. Right? And so that, again, so the relationship between various attempts to improve an economy and rebellion are complicated. So if we want to think about that in data, we got to be careful. So the first thing you might do if you want to answer this question is just go out and gather a lot of data on whether or not countries have conflict and whether or not countries are rich or poor. And you might just start by comparing countries that are rich or poor and whether or not they have conflict or not. Right? And people have done that. And if you do that, what you'll find is that poor countries are much more likely to have conflict than rich countries. Right? And so it's tempting, indeed many a policy brief concludes from this, that the answer to solving violence is reducing poverty. Because after all, there's this negative correlation between a country's wealth and its level of violence. Right? That's not, whether the policy conclusion is right or not, we can talk about at the end, that inference isn't right at all. Right? So the fact that poor countries, yes?
Isn't the United States a counterexample to your first statement? Poor countries have much more conflict than, the United States is involved in conflicts, some heavy-duty conflicts for many years.
So to be clear about 2 things. One is that this is about conflict inside the country, so political violence inside the country, not propensity to engage in conflict in other countries. The other is that, of course, this is a statement about averages. So there may be some very rich countries with political violence going on. Britain was a very rich country with a long-standing terrorist conflict, for example, which is not a counterexample to the statement about the average, which is that on average, rich countries have much less violence than poor countries. So the causal interpretation of this, of course, isn't right at all, and there's lots of reasons why it's not right. The easiest way to see that it's not right is to just think about, say, a company thinking about investing in a country. So one thing a company does when it thinks about investing in a country, and by investing I mean, say, building a factory there. One thing it does is assesses the risk environment. And so if its advisors say to him, that country is on the brink of a major terrorist conflict or a major rebellion, they might say, how about the neighboring country? That's a sort of an easy thing for a company to do. And so a thing which might be true, which would fuel this relationship in the data, is that instead of poverty causing conflict, conflict causes poverty. Right? And of course it does, in lots of ways. Conflict, of course, destroys infrastructure, destroys human capital, does all sorts of bad things, and it also deters investment. So there might be all sorts of reasons that the causal relationship is the reverse, that the reason we see a relationship between poverty and conflict is not that poverty causes conflict, but that conflict causes poverty. Of course, there might be lots of other problems. For example, there might be lots of other things which cause both conflict and poverty, say good political institutions. I'm a political scientist, so that's the one I want to point to. But anyway, the point is you can't simply gather all this data, say, look, poor countries have lots of conflict, we better get rid of poverty and we'll get rid of conflict. That just won't do as a scientific inference. So the next thing you might want to do is say, well, can I find some source of change in a country's economy that comes from outside that I can use to look at how that change in the economy affects violence? And so a thought that a lot of researchers had, and I think an interesting thought is, look, countries are stuck with their commodities. You're a country, you have some oil or you don't have some oil. You have the climate to grow wheat or you don't have the climate to grow wheat. You've got a commodity bundle which characterizes your country. And the value of that commodity bundle depends on the world price of those commodities. So you happen to grow coffee, and you're in Africa, and then Colombia has a really bad year for coffee, and all of a sudden the world price of coffee goes up, and you're richer for reasons having nothing to do with your internal economy, just because Colombia had a bad year. So you can try and use those kinds of shocks to leverage change in the economy and see if that results in change in conflict. And the answer when you do that kind of study is you see no relationship at all. So when external things change in a way that affects your internal economy, it doesn't seem to shift your conflict environment at all in the data. Which, when people sort of first found this, led people to think, the economy doesn't actually matter at all for these sorts of things. That's not right either. But it's not right in a much more subtle way. So remember I told you at the beginning there's all these mechanisms, right? There's all these mechanisms. There's lots of ways that the economy can affect conflict, and it can affect it up and it can affect it down. So I want to tell you about a study which tries to use that thought to try and understand why this inference from changes to the value of your commodities to no changes in violence doesn't mean the economy doesn't matter. And here's the thought I want to give you. Some commodities matter a lot for that opportunity cost mechanism, right? So some commodities are really labor intensive. They give a lot of people jobs. And when those commodities become valuable, people get jobs, individuals become richer and maybe less likely to rebel. Other commodities aren't labor intensive and don't provide many jobs, but they're easy to steal. And so when they become more valuable, that predation mechanism, that now I could win a really valuable prize, might come into play. So when we look at all of a country's commodities and we look if they go up or down, we're bundling together those two different kinds of things which might act in different directions. When a commodity that uses a lot of labor goes up, that might reduce violence. When a commodity that's very capital intensive goes up, that might increase violence because of predation. And if we bundle those together and just say what happens when commodities go up, we might see some things pulling violence up and some things pulling violence down, and on average nothing happening, and we've made a mistake. So what we need to do is disaggregate these commodities in a way that lets us try and understand these different mechanisms separately. And the only way to do that is abandon our attempt to sort of analyze these things all across the globe at once and really dig inside an individual conflict where we can really look at a detailed way. So I want to talk to you about Colombia. Colombia has three important commodities. I'm going to talk about two of them. Right? So one important commodity for Colombia is coffee. A second important commodity for Colombia is oil. And the third critical commodity for Colombia, of course, is cocaine. I'm going to abstract away from the cocaine issue for today, although I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A. There are things we can say about cocaine. So in this study, the authors thought, look, coffee is a really, really labor-intensive commodity. You got to have people picking coffee beans on a plantation. It's very labor-intensive. And so the thought is that commodity is really going to affect this opportunity cost mechanism. When the price of coffee falls, farmers' wages are going to fall, people are going to become more willing to fight, and violence should go up in coffee-producing regions relative to the rest of the country. Oil, on the other hand, is a capital-intensive commodity, but the rebels steal it, and they steal it in several ways. They actually directly drill into the pipelines and steal it, and they also hold up for extortion local managers. So when the price of oil rises, there's more revenue in oil regions. It's possible to extract more resources through predation, and conflict should go up. Right? So what these authors do is they say, look, happily for us, We have in the world shocks to the world price of coffee. So this is the world price of coffee, the dark line. And what you can see is a sort of jump up and then a long run down, starting in 2007. We also have shocks to the world price of oil. So what I just want to show you here in this picture, that line, the vertical line, is where the price of coffee started dropping. And what you can see is the solid line is the amount of violence in coffee-producing regions of Colombia, and the dashed line is the amount of violence in non-coffee producing regions of Colombia. And what you see is, as the price of coffee, right, before the price of coffee shocks, those things are sort of moving together, and you get this rundown in the price of coffee. Opportunity costs are going down because wages are going down. People are becoming more willing to fight, and they separate. The coffee-producing regions start having much more violence, whereas relative to the non-coffee-producing regions. The idea being that this is evidence inside Colombia of this kind of opportunity cost mechanism. The economy matters here in this subtle way. It matters for places where coffee prices matter for places that affect coffee, but not places that don't produce coffee. And we could do the same thing for the international price of oil. We have this run-up in the international price of oil. And what you see here is they again come apart. Here we're getting the value of the commodity going up instead of going down, and we're seeing violence go up in the oil-producing regions, but not as much in the non-oil producing regions. So the idea here being you're getting this separation. These two commodities are acting in exactly the opposite ways. Drops in the price of coffee cause violence, increases in the price of oil look like they cause violence. And so there's this very subtle thing going on that when you aggregate things up, you completely miss. And the only way to find it is, one, to have a serious set of thoughts about the theoretical mechanisms, and then to dig inside a conflict with very, very fine-grained data. Talk about one other thing about the economy. So this is about the relationship between poverty and education and violence. So a fact which you may have heard if you follow these things at all, this is data from the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. People who engage in terrorism, in particular Palestinians who are members of Hamas and Hezbollah, are better educated and less likely to be unemployed and have higher incomes than the population in general. Right? And the sort of standard interpretation of this, again, is, look, poverty must not matter. Lack of education must not matter because the terrorists themselves, they're not poor and they're not ill-educated. So let me give you a very simple model of supply and demand for terrorists that's going to suggest that that's not right. So I've got two people here. On the left is supposed to be somebody who looks kind of like a doofus, and so I guess that's, yeah, it's your left. So they're supposed to be not terribly well educated, low human capital. And on the right is a scientist with lots of high human capital. And the idea being that these people have differential opportunities in the labor market, but they also might be differentially useful as terrorist operatives. This was the quote I skipped over, which is that these tasks are difficult. I'll tell you a fact from another study, which is that the modal suicide terrorist attack kills exactly one person, the suicide terrorist, because something like 35 or 40% of suicide terrorists blow up their bomb prematurely due to a mistake. It's not trivial to be a successful terrorist operative. So here's the thought, the very simple thought. Suppose you're in a world in which the economy is very good, and so there's some jobs. Your doofus still can't find a job and ends up being a terrorist, but your scientist gets a job and doesn't mobilize, even though they're both sympathetic with the cause. And then the economy tanks, and all of a sudden there's fewer jobs. The opportunity cost thing happens, and everyone's willing to mobilize. Right? The terrorist organization now can select a higher quality operative. Okay? And maybe they'll expand, or maybe they'll just throw out the bad people. But the idea is, the reason that we don't see poor and ill-educated terrorist operatives is not necessarily because those people never want to mobilize, but because terrorist organizations, like any employer, select the best people they can find. And so it could still be that changes to poverty, changes to education, affect the willingness of people to mobilize, even though we don't see poor people primarily as the operatives. And indeed, if we look in the data, so this is evidence from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we find two things. One, we find that it is in fact true that measures of human capital are correlated with your efficacy as a terrorist. So people who are highly educated operatives are 60% more likely to be assigned to a difficult target, that is a target inside Israel proper as opposed to in the occupied territories, and on average kill 4 to 6 more people per attack than poorly educated operatives. And it's also the case that as unemployment goes up, so a 1 standard deviation increase in unemployment leads to a 38% more likely that you have an operative who has a college education, an 18% increase that they have prior experience, and a 21% increase that they're assigned to a difficult target. So there's all sorts of evidence that, in fact, one, terrorist organizations understand that human capital matters, and are selecting and assigning based on it, and two, that the economy matters for the access of the terrorist organizations to high-quality operatives, and therefore to the kind of operations they carry out. So again, the relationship between the economy and the kind of violence we see is very complicated and subtle, and it requires careful theorizing and looking at very fine-grained data to find it. But if we just sort of look at the very rough aggregate stuff, we're going to make all sorts of mistakes. So to sum up that bit on the economy, what we seem to see, to the best of our ability to make sense of this, is that at least 2 channels seem to matter. There does seem to be this opportunity cost channel, that if you can make people's lives better, they're somewhat less inclined to mobilize, and that diminishes the capacity of violent groups. But there also seems to be another important channel, which is that when countries get richer, they are bigger prizes, and that encourages violent groups. And that suggests sort of subtle kinds of policy conclusions about the kind of economic development that's likely to be successful versus not successful in trying to end violence. Right, let me talk a little bit about strategies of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. So I have here 5 topics, which I won't get through. And I'll talk about a few of them. These are various ways in which we think about the problems of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. So let me start by talking about the problem of facing a strategic adversary. This will be the most game-theoretic bit for Colm. But it'll be done in pictures. Okay? So here's the thought about the challenge for a counterinsurgent or a counterterrorist who's facing a strategic adversary, somebody who's going to adapt to what you do. Okay? So here's my model. I've got a model in which I've got a terrorist with a pitchfork. It seems like a politically correct version of a... So we've got a terrorist with a pitchfork, and I've got 2 potential targets. One looks like a scientific site, and one looks like an amusement park. So I'm a government, and I have to decide what to do with my counterterrorism money. And I think, wow, I really care a lot about that scientific target, so I'm going to protect it very seriously. Right? So I'm going to make it almost impossible for the terrorists to attack it by devoting a lot of resources to it, making people take off their shoes before they go into it, no liquids allowed, who knows. Yeah, so what's our strategic terrorist going to do? He's going to say, oh, look at that well-protected scientific site. I'm going to go attack the other site. Right? So the government says, the terrorists seem to be attacking amusement parks. And they're fighting yesterday's war, and so they protect the amusement parks, and our strategic terrorist now says, they've left the scientific sites unguarded. Right? Our strategic terrorist adapts to what we do and avoids it. And so we're left with a situation in which all we can do is partially defend each thing, leaving our terrorists somewhat confused and having to choose between them. Now, that's all fine and well when you've got 2 sites and a lot of money. But of course, we have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of sites. And the problem for the counter-terrorist is the strategic nature of the adversary means you have to spread your resources extremely thin, because if you start spending extra money in one site, it's going to be wasted because they'll just avoid that site and attack another one. Right? To give you, if you doubt that terrorists are this strategic, let me show you a little bit of data. That's how we convince people at the Harris School, I'm told. If theory is not enough. So this is a graph over time of skyjackings in the United States. So in 1972, some of you will remember, they installed metal detectors in all domestic US airports in response to a spate of hijackings in the 1960s and early 1970s. So the red line is when the metal detectors went in. And what you see is what looks like an extremely successful counterterrorism program.
Is that also when Cuba agreed to send them back?
When what?
Cuba agreed to send hijackers back to us?
Yeah, though that's a very small, I mean, we're talking about, there were years in which we had 60 or 70 hijackings for all sorts of causes. US domestic ransom takings, all sorts of, the history of domestic hijackings in the United States in the 1960s is quite interesting. People would take an airplane for anything. So what you see is a massive drop in hijackings right after we install metal detectors. It looks like a really successful counterterrorism program, right until you look at the data on all other terrorist hostage-taking events that didn't happen on airplanes, which happily I have on the next slide, which is almost a one-for-one offset of the reduction in hijackings. Right? Now, you may say that a hijacking is a much worse thing than the taking of an embassy or the taking of a conference center, and that might be right, and this might have been a good program. But it's not nearly so good a program as it looks like just looking at the drop in hijackings. Right? You can prevent hijackings, which is different than preventing terrorism. And that's a very difficult problem for a counterterrorist. All right, so that's sort of the fundamental strategic problem. Let me talk now a little bit about some of the intervention programs we've tried. The sort of dominant paradigm of thinking about counterinsurgency in the United States today, sort of led by David Petraeus, is this thinking about hearts and minds, benign counterinsurgency. You try and co-opt the community. Right? The Mao's line is that insurgents are fish swimming in the sea of the people, and so if you can win the people over to you, the insurgents can't fight anymore. And so you try and win people's hearts and minds through community engagement, through economic development, and so on. So scholars have spent a lot of time trying to evaluate how that works. Let me start by talking about Iraq. So the program I want to talk about in Iraq is called the Commander's Emergency Response Program. This is a program that's administered by the United States military in Iraq. It was originally funded actually with money captured by the military during the initial invasion of Iraq. They found several $100 million in gold bullion, and they called the Treasury Department and said, "We found all this gold bullion, what ought we to do with it?" And the Treasury said, "Send it to Washington, we should like it." And the military thought about that for a little bit, and then they said, according to the rules of war, if we find money on the battlefield, we can use it for war fighting. So we're going to keep it, and we're going to start a military-administered development program, which was then later continued funding through the United States Congress. Ultimately, we spent about $3 billion on this program. The program is interesting because it's run at a very localized level by military commanders. Brigade commanders, battalion commanders, lieutenant colonels can request programs, tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars for local development in their little area of control, their little area of operation. They can build wells, they can build latrines, they can build a school, they can do things like they build a road. Okay? So that's what this money was used for. So what we want to do is study what happened to violence when this money arrived. Right? But that's actually a hard problem, so let me give you a sense of why. So suppose that we have sort of just two areas of Iraq, one that starts with high violence, there's say 30 attacks per month, and another which starts with lower levels of violence, say 10 attacks per month. And all of a sudden the military finds this SERP money, right? That's what the program's called. And it decides that what it wants to do is try and spend the money where it's going to make a difference, where there's a lot of violence. So the money flows to the high violence areas, and it works. So violence reduces by 10 attacks per month in this high violence area. They don't spend any money in the low violence area, but there's a little reduction in violence there, maybe just because overall trends in the war is going well, and there's a reduction of 3. So now we come along and we're researchers and we say, like, look, we've got an area that got some money, an area that didn't get some money. Let's compare and see whether the money worked. And we find that the place with money has 20 attacks per month and the place without money has 7 attacks per month, and we think this money caused violence, right? Because the place with money has 13 more attacks per month than the place without money. And that inference is wrong. But it's an easy mistake to make. Because I showed it to you schematically, and so it seems ridiculous. But of course, what you do in the world is you just go out and say, look, we got a bunch of places that got a bunch of development projects, a bunch of places didn't. Let's compare how they're doing. That's a very natural kind of comparison to make. So instead, what you've got to do is say, look, we want to control for the initial level of violence. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say, how did violence change in this area that got money? And how did violence change in the area that didn't? And then how did those changes differ? Right? Control for the baseline level of violence. And if we do that, we say, look, the place that got money had a decrease in violence of 10 attacks. The place that didn't get money had a decrease in violence of 3 attacks. And it looks like the money mattered by decreasing the level of violence by 7, taking out the overall trend from this lower comparison. So that's the research design idea here. And if you look in Iraq, here's what you find. You find one. So on the x-axis here is the amount of SERP money a district got, and on the y-axis is violence as recorded by the United States military. These are so-called significant acts. So this is violence that any member of the coalition forces witnessed. And what you see from the black line, I know it looks like a big cloud, but what you see is that money does in fact chase violence. So if you just compared places with money and without money, what you'd find is the more money you have, the more violence you have. That doesn't mean the program's not working, right? Money is chasing violence because the military is trying to prevent the violence. So if we instead do this exercise of comparing the differences, we get a picture that looks like that. Places that got a bigger increase in money had a bigger reduction in violence. And so it looks like the money is working. Okay? And in particular, each dollar of per capita SERP spending looks like it decreases violence per capita by about 3%, which is really quite a big effect. You can go a little further, and this is, I think, a bit interesting, which is, if you remember, in 2007, there was a major change in US strategy in Iraq called the Surge, which was an increase in troops, but also a change in tactics, which involved much more hands-on, on-the-ground counterinsurgency. Soldiers got out of their armored vehicles and walked beats. And what you see, if you divide the data into before the surge and after the surge, is that all of the effect happened after the surge. The thought being that this money works when the military really knows the local details of what's going on. That's what we know from Iraq. A similar program in the Philippines, we can learn about how it worked sort of through a different strategy, which I think is also interesting. So in the Philippines, they've had long ongoing multiple insurgencies. This is a development project that they attempted in order to try and end a separatist, an Islamic separatist insurgency. And what they did was this. They offered a fairly large development project, about $500,000, about 15% of a city's budget, to any city in the bottom quartile of poverty within a province. So you took, yeah, I've got, according to my clock, I have 7 minutes. All right. So they offered money if you were poor enough. You had to be in the bottom quartile. So that presents a great opportunity for a researcher, because a researcher can say, look, we've got 2 towns. And they're both kind of poor, but not, they're both around the 25th percentile the year before the program starts, town 1 and town 2. And then some crazy things are going to happen. One town has a flood, the other town doesn't, something like that, right? Some little thing happens, and one ends up just below the threshold, and the other ends up just above the threshold. They were essentially identical beforehand, but one gets the money and one doesn't for random reasons, right? So we get, the money comes along, and then all sorts of random things happen. One town ends up in the 24th percentile, one ends up in the 26th percentile. And now we have 2 towns which are essentially like an experiment. They were the same, one got the money, the other didn't, because of, just under, just above the threshold, and we can compare violence and see the effect of the money. So here's a picture of that data. So the line is when the program was implemented. The dark curve is the towns that were eligible. The dashed curve is towns that turned out not to be eligible, right around the threshold. And what we see is, before the program came into effect, so that's the vertical line where the program came into effect, those two sets of towns were identical with respect to violence. And right when the money shows up, they diverge. And they diverge in a somewhat surprising way, though remember the story I told you about predation? The towns that got the money have a massive surge in violence. And this is consistent with anecdotal evidence that the rebels started attacking those towns to steal the money. So here we see exactly the opposite effect. We see a sort of well-intentioned development project causing predation and an increase in violence. Right? And the estimate is that the towns that got the program had on the order of an extra 500 casualties each year, all the towns, as a result of having gotten the money instead of not. I'm going to skip over co-ethnics for time's sake and talk about crackdowns quickly. So crackdown, so another way you might fight a counterinsurgency if you're not David Petraeus, but rather, say, a commander of the Russian military, is killing a lot of people. That's kind of a traditional way to fight a counterinsurgency, is kill a lot of people. So the sort of most famous version of that in recent history is the Second Chechen War, where the Russians fought an incredibly brutal but incredibly effective counterinsurgency that ended a very serious rebellion. So we might want to look at whether or not killing a lot of people works or not. We might not want to, even if it works, we might not want to recommend it as policy, but we might want to know how it works. So again, there could be lots of channels by which various kinds of crackdowns cause or don't cause violence, right? So it could lead to a deterrence effect, which decreases violence. It could reduce rebel capacity and decrease violence. But it could also cause backlash and a desire for revenge, which might increase violence. It could cause an increase in anti-government sentiment and support for rebels, which could increase violence. It could cause the factions to split apart and start fighting each other and causing. There's lots of ways in which crackdowns might backfire. So here I'll show you a little bit of data from Afghanistan. So in Afghanistan, of course, there's violence by both coalition forces and insurgents, which kills each other but also kills a lot of civilians. So we're going to look at the effect of those civilian casualties on public sentiment towards the Taliban as well as towards ISAF, towards the coalition, and also look at its effect on the amount of violence. So here is just a map of Afghanistan, and you can see that it's a heat map that shows the civilian casualties as well as the amount of insurgent activity. So you can see it almost all happens in these Pashtun-controlled areas along the Pakistani border. Right, these are the areas like Helmand that you hear about in the news all the time where most of the fighting is going on, because this is where the Taliban has significant control. And so what I just want to show you quickly is these pictures. So the upper picture shows you the effect of a civilian casualty on the amount of violence coming out of a town if that civilian casualty was caused by ISAF, by the coalition forces. Okay, so what you see is where the red line is, that's where the civilian civilian casualty occurs. So beforehand, there's some baseline level of violence, then a civilian attack occurs, and there's a significant run-up in insurgent attacks coming out of that area. So you kill a civilian, and violence by insurgents spikes. Okay? The same does not happen when you have a civilian casualty caused by the Taliban. So you have this sort of asymmetric response. When the coalition kills people, that leads to an increase in insurgency. When the Taliban kills people, nothing happens. You don't see a concomitant decrease in insurgency. So there's this asymmetric response. The coalition seems to get blamed in some way. The Taliban doesn't. You can see the same thing. Some friends of mine went out and did a survey in Helmand province, which was not the brightest thing to do, but they did it. And you can see the same thing in public opinion. So this is shows you that people who were victimized by ISAF on the left are significantly more supportive of the Taliban relative to ISAF. But people who've been victimized by the Taliban don't react much. So again, you have this in Afghanistan, it looks like civilian deaths backfire against the coalition, but don't backfire against the Taliban. I don't know why that is. It's a very hard question to answer, but that's what the data seem to suggest. We see something similar in the Mexican drug war. I'm going to skip through the actual data, but what we see is that towns that engage in significant counter-narcotic activity as a result of electoral outcomes, so a change in governing party, see a significant run-up in violence, and towns that don't see a run-up in violence. And then we see the drug traffickers changing their routes by which they traffic drugs around those towns which have the increased counter-narcotics, harkering back to our problem of strategic adversaries. That's what we see in Mexico. Let me skip to Chechnya and just tell you one last story. In Chechnya, which is where the Russians fought their brutal counterinsurgency, the way we can learn about it in Chechnya is that we have this map that was created by Jay Lyle at Yale, in which he used patterns of shelling as well as Google Maps to figure out where the secret Russian artillery bases are. He's banned from Russia for life for that. And then used the following amazing fact, which is that there are dates in the calendar where we know that the Russian artillery troops were resupplied. And the anecdotal evidence from journalists is got drunk because they got their resupplies and shot off their artillery at random. And we can look at the response in terms of violence from random shellings, right? So you might worry, if you just look at towns that got shelled and didn't, that the shelling was strategic and you can't learn much from that. But here we have certain dates on which there was random shelling, and we can look at what happens to violence after random shelling, and what we see is a town that gets shelled by the Russians has a dramatic decrease in future violence coming out of it, which is an interesting fact, right? Because the United States, fighting what is, an attempt at a benign counterinsurgency, sees massive backfiring when it kills civilians. The Russians, on the other hand, fighting an explicitly brutal counterinsurgency, when they kill civilians, get a big bang for the buck, right? Well, why might that be? It might be because when you're trying to convince civilians that you have their best interests at heart, right, and you're trying to win hearts and minds, when you kill them, it really hurts that strategy. When you've explicitly adopted the policy, if you guys continue to support the rebels, we are going to kill you, then when they see a lot of capacity for violence, they are in fact deterred. And so we see again these two different mechanisms happening in two different counterinsurgencies in a way that's comprehensible when you think about the fact that the governments are in fact trying to use different counterinsurgency tactics. So again, sort of the implications of what you do depends on where you are and what kind of war you're trying to fight. Right? It's complicated and subtle, but comprehensible when we dig into it. All right, so I'm going to stop there and take questions for 15 minutes.
What do you see as the biggest threat to the United States in the future? What kind of terrorism? And how should we fight it?
So I would say, the first order thing I would say is that terrorism, domestic terrorism carried out in the United States is not a serious threat to the United States, and we are spending way too much trying to fight it. That terrorism kills very, very few Americans. I say that even in light of the tragedy in Boston. Terrorism kills very few Americans. And in terms of just cost-benefit analysis, it is unimaginable that the trillions of dollars that we've spent on counterterrorism can be justified. I think the places where terrorism matters are the places where it's potentially destabilizing sort of regimes that are critical for regional or global security. And so I think terrorism in the Middle East, and more importantly, I think insurgency in the Middle East, is a really serious foreign policy problem. That said, I think one of the things I want to say is we ought not think there's easy levers we can pull to do anything about it. These are very complicated things. Nation building, intervention in these sorts of conflict is, I think, all but impossible, especially for a democracy that's committed to not engaging in the kind of brutal counterinsurgency that might actually work.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up. I've done some work in counterterrorism, and I think that our biggest threat is biological terrorism in the United States, which will be devastating, and we're not paying enough attention to that. One of the things that people do is they come to big institutions, they get great education in molecular biology, they go to various places, and they're manufacturing biological weapons. All you need to do is put anthrax on the plane, everybody will die in 2 days, and nobody will fly. Or you put into the ventilation system, and it creates a real tragedy. I'm surprised it hasn't happened, thank God it hasn't, but that is our biggest threat.
So I think it's a reasonable view. I think my experience is that there's a lot of disagreement in the sort of counterterrorism community as to how much we should worry about weapons of mass destruction. There's a camp that says, look, it's so easy. It'd be so easy. We should worry a lot. And there's another camp that says, look, it's so easy, and it has never happened despite all the people who claim they want to attack us. Maybe the threat's not so big. I have a view, but I think reasonable people can disagree about how serious this threat is. I think that to the extent that concern about biological weapons or nuclear weapons, people worry a lot about the Pakistani nuclear arsenal in particular, or people used to worry about these Russian backpack bombs, are really first-order concerns. The kind of counterterrorism we have pursued post 9/11 is not the right kind of counterterrorism to be pursuing to mitigate those threats in any event. Wow, a lot of hands. Yes?
All right.
What's the right kind of
What's the right kind of what?
The microphone behind you, sir. The microphone's behind you.
I actually had a question that I'd like to ask that's totally off topic of that. I took strategy with Robert Pape a couple years ago. I don't know how familiar you are or have worked with him on this, but he really advocates the idea that terrorists are more likely to be highly intellectual, well-educated individuals who are highly invested in their communities because they have a greater sense of commitment to that community and feel that they have a greater obligation to defend it in a lot of senses. And so I can see that coming forth in the economic model where if the economy tanks, they have nothing to prevent them from, like, this is their only recourse. But I was wondering if you have come across any evidence that people are willing to leave their jobs because of this sort of altruistic motivation in the neighborhood, or if there you think would be a way to track it and kind of learn from, you think it's possible to do that?
So I'll say this. This is actually probably the only issue on which Bob and I agree. So, but I mean, I certainly think there's something to that point of view. There's certainly plenty of anecdotal evidence that this. I mean, especially if you look at, say, the leftist European terrorists of the 1960s and 1970s, these were well-educated people who had good job opportunities, who for ideological reasons, dropped out of the economy. I would say my sort of meta comment on this would just be that to the extent that matters for policy, it seems to matter because we're worried about trying to actually predict who's going to become a terrorist, and I think that's a fool's errand. It's a needle in a haystack. It's an impossible problem, and there's no hope. There's no hope that we're going to have a profile, and so we ought not try and have one.
You don't like what we're doing. What would you suggest? What do you think would be a better method to stop terrorism?
Well, so I mean, so the two things I'll say is I think that, as I tried to indicate in the talk, I think the hardening of targets is the thing I don't like. I think hardening of targets against terrorists doesn't work because they're strategic. What I do, to the extent that one wants to fight terrorism, it seems to me that the kinds of things you can do are investments in things which can't be gotten around, which is to say things like intelligence, right? So things like intelligence are much more likely to work than things like airport security. And to try and think hard about these kinds of arguments about what actually motivates people to become a terrorist, not in order to try and predict who's going to become a terrorist in the sense of an individual and track them, but in order to try and fight systemic things. That said, I think the state of knowledge is such that we don't know enough to invest sort of serious money in big projects along those lines because we're grasping at straws, and so that's maybe not totally satisfactory. But I'm an academic; I don't have to actually choose what to do with the money, right? And so I think my obligation is to say, to the extent that people are telling you we know what to do, I don't think we know what to do.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of a combination. I'm a business, I'm academic, I'm a psychologist, and after I turned 65, I got 2 master's degrees in history. I took my internship, by the way, in a prison, so I've interviewed many murderers. As far as my own personal bet would be, just from seeing these types of people, the PLO would die until the last Palestinian. I don't think they're planning on death themselves. They gather tons of money, and this is true as most terrorists live off the poor people that they get all fired up, using even retarded children sometimes to deliver the bombs. My feeling is that I kind of like the Reagan approach, who if airplanes shoot at you, if you shoot back and kill them, if that doesn't stop them, you take out where they came from. And that includes the top people in it. You don't negotiate them, you get rid of them. We played footsie with them for a long, long time. And I think I'm tired frankly, of it. I have a very, I think, somewhat objective viewpoint towards what we've experienced. Diplomacy, I don't think they quite understand, but they do understand a missile through their bedroom window.
So let me just say 2 quick data-driven things about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So one is, if you do people have done surveys. I almost talked about this today, but I left it out. If you look at Palestinian public opinion about negotiations with Israel, 2 important things stand out. So one is, despite, say, what the Hamas charter says, 45% of people who self-profess to be Hamas supporters in surveys also profess to be in favor of negotiations with Israel about a 2-state solution. I put up here a picture, and this is a picture of stock performance, but we could do the same thing with public opinion. What happens following an Israeli targeted assassination of a Hamas leader? So this is what happens to the stock market in Israel relative to the world stock market, but the exact same pattern happens in Palestinian public opinion, which is that when Israel assassinates a Hamas military leader and doesn't kill any civilians, the Israeli stock market goes up relative to the world market, and Palestinian public opinion Palestinian opinion about negotiations with Israel doesn't go down. When Israel kills a Hamas political leader, or when Israel engages in a targeted assassination that kills civilians, the Israeli stock market plunges relative to the world stock market, and Palestinian public opinion about willingness to negotiate with Israel drops. So it seems to me that in this particular case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's in fact significant evidence that there's heterogeneous opinion, and that different kinds of counterterrorism policies have different kinds of effects. Whether that means negotiation or not negotiation is the right policy, I'll leave for another day. But I don't think it's the case that the evidence suggests that that the kind of policy you pursue doesn't affect the willingness of the other side to engage in negotiations. Yeah.
So I've spent some time in law school considering the issue of terrorism and how would you treat that as military or sort of civilian engagement. And so that leads to the question here when we talk about asymmetric conflict. What does that actually include, and is it more similar, how do the borders tend to fit in terms of getting closer to an asymmetry that looks more like, state actors versus criminals and governments?
So the question was how we think about the lines between asymmetric conflict and conventional conflicts, terrorism and rebellion and these sorts of things. I think this is a good question, and I think the answer, in some sense, the fact that you say that you thought about it in law school points in important ways to the answer, because I think the answer depends very, very heavily on what you're doing with the question. So this is actually a question that my work is on now, not on the definition, but I'm interested in the idea that the kinds of policy levers we pull, changes to the economy, changes to the security environment, not only affect people's willingness to fight, but affect the kind of tactics that rebels use. So you change the economic environment, people become more or less willing to mobilize, and now the rebels can change to more or less labor-intensive tactics. You can actually see a change from a terrorist conflict to an insurgency because of changes to the economy, say. And so for someone like me, who's interested in the causes of conflict or the remedies to conflict, I think the answer is these are all of a piece because they are chosen strategically by the people engaged in the violence. It's not like it's not like you are a terrorist. You're a rebel engaged in terrorism because that's the optimal thing for you right now. And if tomorrow the optimal thing for you is something else, you'll do that. I think Chechnya is a great example of this. The Russian counterinsurgency in Chechnya, which was so successful, I think is directly accountable for the Moscow subway bombings because the environment became so difficult for the Chechen rebels, they could no longer put boots on the ground. And the only tactic available to them at that point was urban warfare with very few people, right? So they transitioned from being civil war fighters to being terrorists because being a terrorist is not a thing, it's a tactic. Now, if you're a lawyer and you want to know what kind of tribunal to hold, you got to have an answer to that question. But I think that the question that the answer to that question is sort of a legal question independent of the analytic question, which is they're all the same, they're just different technologies.
So I would like to, I'm obliged to do this. I would like to, one thing about the last question may, I think, have something to do with it, which is it would be instructive to have a look at today's New York Times, which talked about an apology by the British Foreign Secretary to Kenyans who took part in the Kenyan rebellion in the 1950s, early 1960s. This is the Mau Mau rebellion. I experienced it at some distance. I was in Ireland where we read about the Mau Mau terrorists, of course. Having been educated in the ways of the British, we interpreted this to mean that these were independence fighters in Kenya. It turns out the British have finally accepted that's the case. This is not because it affects Ethan's analysis, but that the emotional response we have can be heavily influenced by the labels that we use. So I think if you define terrorism in terms of particular tactics or particular forms, you may have some possibility of agreement as to what it means. But if you use it simply as a way of expressing your prejudices, then it's not helpful to the debate. That's my only observation on this. I would like to say how much I enjoy Ethan's work, game theoretic though it may be. Game theorists have a fault in common with many others at the University of Chicago of thinking that because they call it a name and it's what they do, they're the people who invented it, and that in fact other people haven't been doing the same thing under different names for many generations. This is of course not the case with Ethan. I was mentioning it only as a possibility that we should bear in mind as we move forward. His work, I think, is very exciting. It brings a different perspective to the study of these subjects, all emotional, and if any of you have any connection through your citizenship, ethnicity, or other to any of these conflicts, it's very difficult to look at them in any kind of objective way, in any kind of rational way, and accept that your prejudices may be wrong. And I think the work that Ethan and others are doing is really moving us forward in this area in a way that has not been happening in the preceding 50 or 60 years. So I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Ethan Bueno de Mesquita for a very exciting and interesting presentation. Thank you. And I have one formal announcement I've been asked to make. Between now and sometime later in the year, you will receive an email communication from the university. For those of you who graduated some years ago, this may be your first email communication from the university, although the fact that you're here suggests that it's not. This will provide a link to a questionnaire, a survey, which I have not seen, but I have no doubt will have been designed with the rigor we associate with the university. And you are asked to complete this so that, although it's almost impossible to imagine, next year's events will be even more exciting than this year's.